Well, thank you, David. That was a nice introduction. And as you might imagine, I do a lot of speaking. This is definitely the first time I've ever followed a chicken dance coming up onto the stage. So it's a first for everything. So thanks for having me here. It's great to see such a great audience. David and I have known each other for several years, back when TinyPulse was actually tiny. So it's nice to be here at your conference today. I want to talk a little bit about some of the research that my organization does, specifically focusing on a relatively broad but very current topic, and that's around organizational agility. Let me give you just a little bit of background, because some of you probably don't know who I4CP is. You can say C3PO if you want. I know it's kind of a mouthful, but it stands for the Institute for Corporate Productivity. And we're a research organization that focuses on the people practices of high-performing organizations. So I have a team of analysts that goes out and researches a variety of different human capital issues, always with a focus on what are high-performing organizations doing differently than low-performing organizations. So what I mean by high performance are companies that have better revenue growth, market share, profitability, and customer satisfaction than their competition. We're not only focused on what are they doing differently than low performing, but through regression analysis, we're looking at what specific human capital practices equate to bottom line business impact, which I think many in the field of human capital have always been looking at. And so we work with a variety of well-known companies overall. We have a membership model where these companies subscribe to get access to that research, and we also have a peer network that they participate in. We're working with the CHROs and that CHRO's team in these companies. So that's a little bit of background on how we operate as an organization and what we do as a company. So let me walk you through some of the things that we've seen out in the market. And I'm going to start with a story that's personal to me, but business related, around what I've seen around organizational culture. And I want to relay a situation. This goes back to 2009. I had two meetings in Silicon Valley, one in the morning and one in the afternoon, both with very iconic Silicon Valley companies. And so for the morning meeting, I walk into the lobby of the headquarters of this iconic company. And it was a very large marble kind of foyer that you walk into. Nobody around, just deadly silent. I could hear my shoes clicking on the floor as I'm walking in. It's just kind of echoing as I walk into this lobby. At the far end of the lobby was a receptionist. Maybe not, the sharpest tool in the toolbox, but the receptionist, greeted me when I came in, kind of gruffly. Said, yeah, let me find the person that you're supposed to meet with. That person came out, got me, and brought me back behind the scenes, and it was just a sea of cubicles where everybody was wearing ties, which I thought was kind of weird for Silicon Valley, and everybody was talking in very hushed tones. It was like deadly silent in this cube land. So we go into this conference room to have our meeting, and we're talking softly because I felt like we were going to disturb the people that were outside the conference room. So I left there thinking, okay, that was a little bit of an odd experience. And then in the afternoon, I went to company number 2. And in company number 2, I walk into their lobby. It's glass. There are plants all over the place. There are people coming in and out, talking to each other, laughing, very casually dressed. I think some were in bikinis and bathing suits, but it was clearly a happy environment. And when I went behind the scenes to meet with the HR exec that I was meeting with, it was pretty similar behind the scenes too as it was in the lobby. So my question is, does culture translate into performance of the organization? If I had invested in both of those companies the moment I walked out of their lobbies, here's what would have happened to my investment. So company number 1 obviously is the one on the bottom. Company number 2 is the one on the top. Any guesses as to which companies these are? Somebody said HP. Who said that? I never get that. That's fantastic. And somebody said Apple over here, I heard. So that's exactly right. So the one on the top is Apple. The one on the bottom is HP. Now, I've shared this story a couple of times. A couple of weeks ago, I was at the EdCast conference in Silicon Valley. I was immediately followed by a speaker from HP. So that was a little awkward for me. But luckily, I had prefaced that speaker on what I was going to do. And I've had this conversation with folks who were in that environment at HP, and they said, you are spot on. That's exactly what our culture was like, and some of the issues that we had with our culture. Now, in fairness to HP, they're very different today, right? They have split up into now 3 companies, and what I'm showing here is HPE stock price, but generally the stock price, if I had invested back then, was going to be relatively flat to down from that time period. So I show you that example because I do think culture really matters in an organization, and you can kind of feel it. I walk into a lot of different companies every day, and you can kind of feel like what's happening with the culture. And one company that I continue to be fascinated by is Microsoft. Now, who's here from Microsoft? Anyone? Nobody. Okay. Oh, did we get one? Okay, all right. So Microsoft is a really interesting story, in my opinion, around organizational agility. I don't know how many of you remember when they rolled out Windows 95, like way back when, but that was kind of a big deal when they did it. There were parties all around the country, and the Rolling Stones, were involved, and so it was an interesting time period. At the same time period, they were under attack by new internet companies. So Netscape, being one of the bigger ones, but a bunch of companies were suddenly causing Microsoft to relook at what they were doing. And while the euphoria around the new operating system was going on, Bill Gates was very, very concerned about what the internet was doing to Microsoft. And so he typed up this memo on a 1940s typewriter, I think, and sent it out to the whole company called the Internet Tidal Wave. And basically, the genesis of the memo is, if whatever you are doing is not web-enabled, stop, make it web-enabled. And that was a remarkable example of organizational agility. Microsoft at that time was still a pretty big company. They did a great job at turning this cruise ship in a different direction, and it really made the company successful. They were successful in web enabling the company. You fast forward to 2007, and now Steve Ballmer's running the company. It's even a much bigger company. And there were a number of things that caught Microsoft off guard. So Google, they never really had a good answer for Google or saw Google coming. All the Apple products that came out, Microsoft famously kind of screwed up mobile inside the organization. And they just weren't able to shift quickly enough to what was happening around them as an organization. I don't want to blame Ballmer for that because, again, it was a much bigger company and much more complicated. But if you fast forward to today, now they have Satya Nadella, the first CEO that's actually come up through the ranks at Microsoft. And in probably the last 15 years or so, I've never seen Microsoft employees more enthusiastic, more excited to be at the company, and looking forward to the promise of the future in the organization. And I think Satya and his team deserve a lot of credit for that. I think Satya came in and said, look, we've got to be agile. There's a lot of competitors everywhere to what we do as an organization. And we have to be much more open, collaborative, and as an organization, not fearing change, but embracing change. And one of the things he's done to embrace that is taken his HR leader, Kathleen Hogan, as his right-hand person around changing the culture. And Kathleen has done a marvelous job working side by side with Satya at getting the company to think about a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. And you'll see this in presentations that Satya does. He'll talk about this. He'll talk about this in shareholder meetings on a regular basis, how they have made this shift. This, on the far right of what you're looking at, is a sticker or a poster that is in conference rooms inside Microsoft. And it asks, is this a fixed mindset meeting or a growth mindset meeting? So they've really taken this to heart. They've really tried to help the employees look at things a little bit differently. We want to be a growth mindset company. And that's, persistent in the face of setbacks. See failure as essential to mastery. Learn from criticism. Find lessons and inspiration in the success of others. And embrace challenges with agility. It all revolves around organizational agility, which I love that they're doing in their culture. So does culture translate into performance? Well, here's roughly what's happened since Satya has taken over at Microsoft. Stock is at an all-time high. He's added $250 billion to the market cap of the company, and you can just really feel it in how the culture is embracing this concept of agility. Now, in our research, we have looked at culture quite a bit and have come up with KPIs from a whole slew of different KPIs that matter most. And here are 5. That the perception of the company is a good place to work. The company is really good at responding to market changes. Company is ready to meet new challenges. They have shared organizational values, and they have the ability in their culture to change overall. All of those are highly correlated with market performance, and that difference that you're seeing there is the difference between high-performing organizations, or HPOs, and low-performing organizations, or LPOs. Again, high performance means companies that have better revenue growth, market share, profitability over the last 5 years versus their competition. And so these KPIs are critical, but it all really revolves around this notion of organizational agility. Now, why is it important to be agile? How many of you remember Blockbuster Video? So it's amazing how quickly Blockbuster went away. But Blockbuster used to be in every single town, on every corner, thriving business. I remember going to their headquarters down in Texas a couple times. I love this quote that came from an analyst report, that investor concern over the threat of new technologies is overstated. Basically, Blockbuster had a bunch of old white guys sitting around a table trying to figure out what's going to happen with streaming media, going forward. And they thought, it's not going to be that big of a deal. There's this company, Netflix, not a big deal. They could have bought Netflix for pennies on the dollar versus what Netflix is worth today, and it put them out of business. They just weren't agile enough. They tried late in their life cycle to make some changes around how they were operating as a business, but they just weren't agile enough. And you have to be agile because things change pretty quickly. If you look at 20 years ago, the most valued companies were GE, Coke, NBC, Exxon, and then Microsoft. 10 years ago, Exxon, Shell, PetroChina, and GE. Today, it's all technology companies. And some of those companies were barely getting going 20 years ago. So the competition has really ramped up. In fact, if you look at unicorns today, and unicorns are private companies with over $1 billion valuation, just in the last 3 to 4 years, look at all the different companies that have popped up on the unicorn radar screen that are now worth, just by their last round of investment, now worth over $1 billion, and some are well over $1 billion. The fact is that a lot of companies are disrupting different industries through technology. And that's really what CEOs are concerned about. And as they look at what's happening to their industries, they're trying to think about their workforce and saying, how can I get my company to be more proactive and anticipate change instead of being purely reactive? How can I create a more flexible, decisive organization that responds quickly and embraces change rather than approach it with fear or skepticism, which we often hear about inside of organizations? And how can I get everyone to impartially evaluate performance on business metrics and plan accordingly? In essence, how can I instill the agility in my company? So we did a report called The Secret Formula for Organizational Agility, a very popular report with some of our member companies, where we looked at hundreds of organizations that we felt were agile and doing a good job about being agile, and did some case studies on some highly agile companies. And as part of that report, we asked a simple question: how many of these companies have experienced disruptive change, which we defined as a major surprise or unexpected shock? And you can see 2/3 of organizations say they've experienced that in the last 2 years. In fact, most of these companies didn't just experience one change, they experienced multiple changes. The majority of organizations had at least 3 major changes per year. In fact, over 60% said that. And of that 60%, a high percentage of those are high-performing organizations. They're organizations that handle change quite well. So as we looked at this, our team came up with what we call the 6 dimensions of agility. And these are really key for organizations and how they think about change. It's the ability to sense change, adapt to change, absorb the impact of change, respond to and act upon change, anticipate, and then exploit and take advantage of change. And so we asked companies, how do you feel you are at these different areas of agility? And then again, separated it by the top 25% of high-performing organizations versus the bottom 25% of low-performing organizations. And you can see that across the board, high-performing organizations, by several factors in most cases, said that they are much better than low-performing organizations at doing this. In fact, I'll draw your attention to the bottom 2, which I think are the most critical. The ability to respond quickly and then exploit or take advantage of changes in the business environment, that is really what separates the winners from the also-rans. That is how your organizations should look at change overall. Not only are we going to handle change just fine, but we're going to take advantage of that change. And in fact, some of the best companies I know, they actively induce change on a regular basis. You probably know some companies like this, where they're reorging on a every 6-month cycle. They're constantly introducing new products. They're looking at how they can improve the business. And it goes back to Andy Grove's old saying, only the paranoid survive. And that's the way these organizations are working. They're constantly trying to think about who is going to kill my company. In fact, I've worked with senior executive staffs in major organizations on this concept. Create a small committee to destroy your company. And sit around and figure out, okay, if we were going to destroy our company and disrupt our industry, what would we do? And that's the way you stay ahead of the industry and embrace change overall. Now, how many of you read a few weeks ago about IBM asking all their employees to come back into the office and not work remotely? Yes, several of you read that. How many of you thought that sounded really stupid? Yeah, me too. I thought, why are they doing this? Didn't they learn from what Yahoo did? And there's several examples out there where companies have tried to do this and have failed, and it's gone over like a lead balloon. Well, I suspected IBM had ulterior motives because they're a smart company. And the CHRO, Diane Gerson, is a friend, and I knew that she would be very involved in this, and they wouldn't do it lightly. They wouldn't just do a knee-jerk reaction. So I called up Diane and I said, okay, hey, what's the story here? And the reason that they decided to do this is they, in their own research inside the company, felt that if they had more face-to-face interaction with their employees, that would improve their overall agility as a company. They did it solely to be more agile as an organization. Now think about that. IBM has 400,000 employees. It's like a small city. And they are worried about being agile as an organization. But what they've discovered is that innovation is so critical to organizational agility, it's hard to schedule it. So when you've got a lot of remote employees, you're constantly just scheduling. Where a lot of innovation happens very informally, and very by chance. And so they wanted to create more of an interactive environment to make that happen. Now, are they totally doing away with remote workers? No, of course not. In fact, most people manage people remotely. You've got team members, especially in a 400,000 person company, that are around the globe. You've got team members that are in different locations. So one of the things that we've been talking to a lot of CHROs about is focus a little bit more on better virtual team management. Very few companies spend a lot of time or training on helping leaders manage more effectively their virtual teams. I know that IBM is thinking about that and working on that, but that was the whole reason they brought people back into the office. So as part of this report that we did, we looked at what are some of the shared organizational values that drive agility. And it was very clear in our research, just looking at high-performing companies, that 5 stood out. And those 5 were innovation, transparency, creativity, diversity, and collaboration. And I was happy to hear Dan, as the previous speaker, talk about the importance of transparency in his organization. Because that is the one thing that I often will point out to companies when they ask, hey, you meet a lot of high-performing companies, what's common about them? Most of them are very transparent about everything. There's no secrets, there's no rumor mill. People are on board, they know how what they're doing really coincides with the mission and goal of the organization. And so that's a very critical component. But I want to walk through each one of these because I think each one in its own right is a critical component of agility. In fact, one of the things that we found is if companies had all 5 of these things, they were 10 times more likely to be a high-performing organization than a low-performing organization, meaning they embraced all 5 of these concepts. So innovation is the one that we've probably done the most research on of those 5 concepts. Really looking at what are companies doing to help their workforce be more innovative. You can see some of the stats. High-performing companies are twice as likely to define and promote organizational values related to innovation. Highly agile organizations are up to 5 times more likely to have cultures that encourage innovation and foster a culture of trust, and that's a big deal I'll talk about in a second. 1 in 5 highly agile organizations acknowledges that their culture supports risk-taking and embraces failure almost 10 times more than lower agility firms. And that aspect of this I love. Does your organization celebrate failure? I love that graphic. But I'll give you 3 examples. How many of you have a can of this in your house or apartment, right? Yeah, I'm sure almost everybody does. So WD-40 is a tiny little company based in San Diego. We had their CEO speak at our conference a few years ago. And one of the things they do in WD-40 is really embrace this concept of mistakes and failure. And it really resonates right in the product lines. Does anybody know where they came up with the name WD-40? So WD stands for water displacement. That's the technology that WD-40 is made on. 40 is the 40th try. There was a WD-38. There was a WD-39. And they didn't get it right until they came out with WD-40. And that's what they named the product. But that notion of embracing failure permeates the organization. On a monthly basis, what that CEO does is gets all the managers together in the company, and they address the entire company and talk about what was the biggest mistake they made in that month. Now think about that. Having your managers just open up, here's my screw up for the month and what I learned from it. And that's what you see in many of these organizations, that this is an educational experience when you embrace failure. But what it mostly does is teaches the employees it's okay to take risks. It's okay to try things and fail, because that's how the best companies really came about. In fact, Angry Birds, and I've got my little cheat sheet down here, this, for many of us, this suddenly just seemed to pop up on our radar screen. But that was 8 years in the making, 52 different tries at getting that game. They almost went bankrupt twice, I think, in creating this game. Took a lot of effort to create that. And then the Dyson vacuum cleaner. This is the one that they're marketing today, was the 5,126th version that they had of that vacuum cleaner before they released it to market. So those are companies that do embrace failure and persisted through failure. Excuse me. So if you look at innovation, we asked companies, how important is innovation overall? And high and low market performers basically both said, yeah, it's important. But then when we asked, how effective are you at it? High market performers, 40% of them said we're very or highly effective at innovation, where low market performers, only 8% said that. Huge difference. And you can see innovation really pop up as a differentiator between companies. So I'll try to go through some of this quickly, because I know we're going to run out of time here. But traits of an innovative culture: You celebrate those new innovations all the time. You celebrate rather than punish risk-taking. You reward leaders who are adept at encouraging innovation, strive to reduce barriers, and then have a learning culture that freely shares knowledge. I'll make these slides available to you guys too, by the way. I want to talk for a second about this idea of a learning culture. We found that top performers are 5 times more likely to say internally they have a learning culture. And what we mean by learning culture is that active knowledge sharing permeates the organization. Learning is in the organizational values. It's something that often is written down in those organizational values. Leaders at all levels are involved in teaching others and reinforcing learning's importance. And we've done a whole report on leaders as teachers. Some of the best companies, they incorporate their leaders as teachers in the organization. I saw a lot of head nods on that one. Learning is reinforced in hiring and in leadership development. So right out of the gate, they're reinforcing the importance of learning. And then the organization is measuring learning's effectiveness overall. All of these things are traits of a learning organization. Oh, I forgot the last one. The managers are rewarded for mobility and development. And this is one that we have called out as a next practice. I think mobility inside an organization is something that's very underutilized. Low-performing organizations are well known for allowing managers to hoard talent and not let that good talent go anywhere. High-performing organizations, they realize that's a path to demise. And so what they try to do is make sure that the top talent gets rotated throughout the organization, and they reward managers for doing that. All right, the next couple are transparency. I mentioned this earlier. Highly agile organizations are much more likely to be transparent than low agility organizations. They're also much more likely to say that they're creative. They create spaces for people to be creative. They create environments to be creative. You'll see that I've had logos of different companies. We did case studies for each one of these, and Citrix is a great example where they create rooms for creativity inside their organization to spark innovative ideas. Now, diversity is another important one. We do a lot of work in D&I. We have a whole board of chief diversity officers that we work with. Diversity is important really for diversity of thought, of course, and for innovation. What you find in homogeneous environments is everybody tends to agree with each other. They tend to look at things the same way. When you've got a diverse environment, you're not doing it just because Jesse Jackson says you should be diverse. You're doing it because it's going to make your organization better. And we've got a whole research report that talks about D&I and how it impacts the bottom line of the organization. And the last one is collaboration, and we're doing a lot of work on this right now. Collaboration inside the organization and sharing that knowledge is so important to being an agile organization because it allows the employee base to act as your eyes and ears and alert the organization to what's happening out in the environment. We just released a big study called Purposeful Collaboration that we did in concert with Rob Cross. Rob is a professor at Babson, and he invented the whole concept of social network analysis. He also had the cover story on HBR last year called Collaborative Overload, which was one of the most highly read articles that HBR has ever published. Because how many of you have ever felt collaborative overload? You got a lot of people asking you for a lot of things. High-performing organizations, they do a good job at combating that, but they also do a great job at encouraging collaboration across the enterprise. Leadership around all this is critical. The traits that promote agility probably will be no surprise to you. Open-mindedness, tolerance for ambiguity, a willingness to be transparent, comfortable taking risks, approaches change with positivity, stays focused in times of uncertainty, and facilitates teamwork. Those are all the very positive ways that leadership can promote agility. The traits that crush agility, and we've actually done research on this, where you have mixed messages about desirability of candid conversation and feedback, executives who are overly focused on their own silos as opposed to the overall organization, where agile leadership is not consistently modeled by the top execs, and top execs don't sufficiently empower other management levels. Those are all the things that just kill agility. So a few takeaways. Get ahead of the market with future-focused processes like how do I kill my company? And one thing I didn't mention is just doing environmental scanning. We see top companies are constantly doing this. They're scanning the environment, looking at some of the things that could potentially disrupt the environment, often acquiring companies that could disrupt the environment and using that ingenuity to help. Include those 5 things in your organization's values and celebrate mistakes, stop punishing failure, and probably most importantly, make knowledge sharing a priority. It's really one that a lot of companies have a lot of work to do on. They think they do it and they don't do a great job at it, but that is a key takeaway. We're doing a new study on organizational agility if anybody's interested. We've been over the last probably 8 weeks interviewing CHROs of Fortune 500 companies around agility. We're going to be launching a survey at the end of this month and then releasing our findings in a few months at our conference about org agility. So if you are interested in this topic, stay tuned. We'll have a lot more around it, and I'm happy to talk to anybody about it further. So I want to leave time for a few questions, so I'll turn it over to David.
Great, thank you. So just real quickly, what are some of the quick wins that an organization that wants to become more agile can do? Some small things that they can put to work right away.
Well, that knowledge sharing is a critical one in my opinion because that gives people a voice inside the organization. So if you give them tools to create knowledge, to create content inside the organization, and they know where to post it. I think one of the issues that a lot of companies have today is there's too many collaboration tools. We've got Slack, we've got Yammer, we've got Chatter, we've got all kinds of things. So you've got to also try to make it clear what are the communication channels inside the organization so that you can share that knowledge very rapidly. That celebrating failure thing is a big one, and that starts at the top often. So try to focus on that. And I think when it comes to innovation, I do a whole hour-long session on what companies can do just to promote innovation inside the organization. What you really want to promote is entrepreneurship. Every organization has a lot of bright minds, has a lot of bright people. The worst thing that can happen is those people leave and go outside, start their own companies, and get funded from an organizational perspective. Some of the greatest companies in the world, they do a fantastic job at keeping those people inside the organization, but funding them inside, allowing them to flourish with their idea. Maybe they're running a new division or a new business line with that idea. Those are some of the programs that really help keep the brightest minds inside the organization.
Okay, well, continuing on with that topic then, so do you think culture changes towards agility have to start at the top, or is it something that managers can do from within? And then the second part of that question is, how do you create organizational, even financial space for people to fail?
Well, so on the first, there's a big debate on, where does culture come from? Is it bottom up? Is it top down? I have a good friend who thinks it's middle out, that, the middle managers, really are the sort of the lifeblood of the company. And so if you get the mind share of those middle managers and get them to, espouse their values, both top and bottom, that's really where innovation comes from, and the culture emanates from. I do think that top-down can work, but it's hard to change a culture very rapidly. What you really have to do is embrace concepts that already exist in the culture that you like, and then start promoting those aspects of the culture. And the second part of your question was about financial space?
Yeah, like when you think, so a lot of companies that are in this room would be a lot smaller than some of the examples that were given. And so failure, when you only can focus on one or two things at a time, becomes very expensive. So how do you, as a smaller company or organization, create that space for both the individuals to fail, but also financially absorb some of those challenges?
Yeah, there's levels of risk taking. On one of my slides, I didn't even mention it. It said intelligent risk taking. So you can't just bet the company and fail and go bravo. You've got to kind of bifurcate what areas you want to take risks in and where you want to fail. But I do think it's important, even in a small company, to encourage that, to talk about it openly. And I think that's a big part of it. Companies aren't transparent about their mistakes. We bet on something, it didn't work, and oftentimes it's kind of hushed tones and we just kind of push it under the rug instead of talking about, okay, where did we screw up, what didn't we see, where didn't we execute, whatever the reasons were for that failure. I think that's a very healthy environment, no matter how big you are.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, Kevin Oakes.